For the last few decades, if you were following the crowd in America, that crowd was headed in pretty much one direction, south. So if you go back to the 1950s, there were about 1 million people living in the Miami metro area. Now it's more like 6.5 million. Hardly anybody lived in the Las Vegas metro area. It's like 50,000 people. Now that's more like 3 million. So what happened? Two things. They're not complicated, but they totally, 100% changed the game.
I mean, air conditioning is the first thing. Cheap homes are the second thing, and they really go hand in hand. And the construction and the design of those homes is a big part of that equation because air conditioning made them inexpensive. They made it possible to use cheap materials and to not use a lot of insulation and to keep those homes really affordable. And it's that combined effect of being able to lower the cost of living and find an affordable place to live that has drawn people south in the United States.
That may be about to change in a way that creates enormous winners and losers. And you might assume that people are going to move because it just gets too hot where they are, or they're sick of their house flooding all the time. But that's probably not why they'll move.
Americans will move not because the actual physical environment changed for them, but because that physical environment changed the economic equation, and they'll move because of those economic pressures.
Abrahm Lustgarten says when the tipping point comes in individual communities, it might seem slow until a few people start to notice their property values are dropping.
You know, when can you put your finger on the pulse of a community and sense when it's weakening? You know, that sort of, you know, the excitement of growth and prosperity versus that, that subtle, slow decline.
Welcome to It Turns Out. I'm Kara Miller. Abrahm Lustgarten is the author of On the Move from Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. He's also an editor-at-large at ProPublica, and he argues we may be starting to see the beginnings of a reshuffling of both people and our finances, unlike anything we've ever witnessed in the U.S.
Just in the last year and a half, we're seeing certainly the slowing of home appreciation, if not the leveling off, and in parts of Florida, a real decrease in the value of homes, where people are increasingly underwater, no pun intended, on their real estate investments. And there are parts of Florida, the Cape Coral area, for example, where there's a population decrease, where people are starting to leave those areas.
What's ahead is something that neither people in the northern nor the southern U.S. are really ready for. But, and this was a surprise to me, some areas do see it coming.
A lot of communities in the north, in the Great Lakes, for example, are preparing for this in really, solid ways. The city of Cincinnati, or the Cincinnati metro area, is undertaking really in-depth sustainability plan and analysis that accounts for or assumes large-scale influx of population. And they're looking at, how do you house those people temporarily? How do you house them in the long term? How do you reconfigure your zoning and planning system so that it accommodates that growth? Cities like Buffalo are doing the same. Ann Arbor, Michigan, the Michigan Association of Planning has been deeply engaged in this question.
Part of the way this migration will happen, Lustgarten says, is something he calls the Great American Climate Scam. It started in Florida, but it has now spread to California, to Texas, to Massachusetts, actually to most states in the U.S. But to see how this could all unravel financially, let's start at the beginning in Florida. And you have to rewind to 1992 when Hurricane Andrew hits Florida. It came ashore as a tropical cyclone, Category 5, very powerful, and it killed more than 60 people and damaged tens of thousands of structures.
And that hurricane happened at a low point economically already. The state was in a recession or something close to it. If it wasn't formally a recession, unemployment was very high. The economic environment was strained. And so it was really this sort of perfect storm, if you will.
And then, added to all this human suffering and the loss of homes and the loss of businesses, there was a seemingly unfixable problem. Floridians were not going to be able to get insurance.
a large number of property insurers went out of business, declared bankruptcy, couldn't cover their claims. Others left the state quickly and stopped offering new policies. And so state leaders saw the confluence of all of these events as really like the economic death knell potential for the state. And they started to see an outflux of people or people who had evacuated from the storm not returning as quickly as they wanted to.
So state leaders came up with a plan, a new policy, really. And it was equal parts brilliant and problematic.
And that policy was the creation of a state-run insurance program called Florida Citizens, which would make insurance available even if the commercial market didn't do it itself. And so that was really the start of a state-run insurance plan.
It was also an inspiration to other states that if you couldn't get companies to insure homeowners or to insure businesses, no problem. Of course, there were problems, and we'll get to that.
And it used this system called FAIR plans, and a lot of states had them. And FAIR plans were meant to be an insurance provider of last resort, but really in exceptional cases, not for large populations. And
okay.
So it adopted this FAIR plan model to create a state-run insurance company, and the state became the insurer for Florida.
And here's that problem that I mentioned before. The reason that insurance companies left the state of Florida is because they couldn't afford to stay. The math just didn't work. And it can be very hard to find a way around the math.
So if you trust a free market system, then insurance, property insurance, it should be your first and earliest signal of climate risk in a funny way, and it is.
But the stakes for Florida were way too high. People in power were starting to see insurance companies pack up and just head for the exits.
And so when they leave, but mortgage banks still require a home to be insured, you have a crunch that is not only like an affordability safety crunch for a homeowner, but is a threat to the entire market and its stability, because if you can't issue mortgages and those banks or Fannie and Freddie Mae cannot hold mortgages that aren't insured, then you will have a collapse of the market and an outflow of people. And so that's the problem that the state of Florida was seeking to address, and it worked. It worked spectacularly well.
The population of Florida has surged since 1990. It's actually almost doubled from about 13 million to about 24 million. And that's gotten the leaders of other states thinking. The hitch is the whole thing may be a ticking time bomb.
So, 32 states now use FAIR plans in a similar way to not using the exact same structure of having a state-run insurance company, but basically subsidize insurance in one way or another to compensate for the risk of growing climate risks. So Massachusetts has it for, sea level rise around Boston or Nantucket. Louisiana, Texas, all of the coastal states rely heavily on these state-subsidized FAIR plans. And the largest at the moment in terms of growth is California because of wildfire risk. And that is what the state of California has been offering to blunt the fear and the real estate market risk from expanded wildfire risk in the state. And California's FAIR plan system, I think, has grown threefold over the last 5 years or something like that.
What do you think would happen if, obviously Florida is a Republican-led state at the moment. What do you think would happen if the people running the state tomorrow said, hey, we believe in the free market. We're done here. We're just going to let private insurers work the way that they do, let insurance markets. We're going to let the insurance market be a free market. What do you think would happen?
And if that includes not capping insurance rates or the rate increases through an insurance commission.
Let's say they were if it takes $100,000 to insure this place, like then charge $100,000.
Yeah. So insurance rates skyrocket, as they're already doing across the country, because some of these forces are not defensible against. So rates skyrocket. Parts of the high risk state become conclaves for the ultra wealthy who can either afford the insurance or self insure and take that risk upon themselves. Some people leave because it becomes far less affordable to protect your property, and the value of property drops because it is uninsurable. And there's still another segment that is kind of trapped. So you'll see a growing population who does not have insurance for their property, whether that's legal with their mortgages or illegal, and they ultimately get foreclosed on and can lose their homes that way. There will be a larger at-risk population. And when the big storms come in, hurricane in Florida or a wildfire in California, those uninsured people will lose everything, and that will accelerate their economic decline. And so what you get, very big picture, is a climate exacerbated divide between the rich and the poor in this country. And it's very clearly tied to things like insurance trends.
I actually even wonder if the very rich, and there certainly are very many very rich people in Florida, would even want to stay because, I mean, what is Miami without any restaurants or coffee shops? Like, you need people who aren't very wealthy to work in those places. I mean, the rich don't both patronize them and work in them, right? So, like, what are these places without any culture or any excitement or nightlife,
Yeah, I mean, that's the very subjective part of, when can you put your finger on the pulse of a community and sense when it's weakening, that sort of, the excitement of growth and prosperity versus that, that subtle, slow decline.
On the other side of this, I talked about like Republicans running Florida and in generally embracing the free market, though clearly not in the insurance market. On the other side, in a place like California or Massachusetts, where there's a lot of kind of government support, it sounds like, of people who live on the coast or in fire zones. These are places where a lot of the population really believes that climate change is happening, is concerned about it. On the other hand, like, how can they justify, if they believe climate change worsening, why support people staying in these high-risk areas?
Yeah, it's a tricky question. I mean, part of the answer is because some people need support, and that is the responsibility of government. And, I think there's a difference between whether that support is provided in order to attract people and grow your population, or to subsidize very wealthy individuals in a way that isn't absolutely necessary. But, imagine, those middle-class communities that also, have high rates of home ownership and are, in a more fragile economic circumstance, and the environment's changing around them. Maybe the sea level is rising or their coast is eroding, and the kind of potential collapse of that market that we've been talking about, and what that means for individual families that can't afford to lose the value of their homes, and the economic downturn that follows all of that. That's an urgent issue for government, for leaders to try to address in the near term. And so there's a justifiable function for that kind of, subsidization of insurance in this case, or other programs. It's really like a more difficult question of how do you draw the line, where is that line, and how do you balance the long-term planning responsibly for the short-term, very real needs of your community.
I'm sure there's also re-election and election incentives here too, which is like, most governors aren't governor for 20 or 30 years. So they're not going to be there for the long term. But in the short term, if you do something that's potentially good in the long term, people might really dislike you in the short term.
Yeah, absolutely. And that sort of short-term quality of political representation goes a long ways towards, interfering with good, smart, proactive, difficult decisions around climate change.
Okay, just you talked about how after Hurricane Andrew happens, 1992, Florida steps in, and then like many other states do something similar later on and say, well, we can't let this sort of, the insurance companies fleeing for the hills be the law of the land here. We need to offer, this insurance of last resort, which ends up being not just last resort, but a lot of people use it. But there isn't like magical finances here. If insurance companies determine, and a bunch have gone actually bankrupt, I think, that work in Florida. Mm-hmm. If insurance companies determine like this is a losing proposition, we don't want to be in Florida. Does that mean that if there's a big storm and the state of Florida is backing you on your insurance, can the state of Florida go bankrupt? Because if the math doesn't work, then the math doesn't work.
Yeah, it can. You're right. It doesn't work. And yes, the state of Florida or the state of California or any other can go bankrupt. Mm-hmm. And, the precariousness that you're describing has been cyclical. But there was a point around 2011, 2012 where insurance experts that I spoke to were afraid that Florida would go bankrupt, where its insurance liabilities exceeded or were such a high proportion of the state's revenues that the possibility of a catastrophic storm repeating like a Hurricane Andrew could bankrupt the state in a very real way. And so you've seen Florida respond to that in a lot of different ways, finding moments of trying to attract insurers back into the state, trying to find moments of pulling back on their subsidization of insurance. But then the next election cycle comes around and people are unhappy about the rising insurance rates, or they choose a candidate who promises to restore that old subsidy, which has happened in Florida, and so it swings back in the opposite direction. I think California also faces this kind of very precarious circumstance where the liabilities of its state fair plan, I forget what the numbers are, but they're now really huge. And as a proportion of the state's disaster budget, they're enormous. And as a proportion of the state's overall budget, they're now noticeable. And so that, that's a dangerous position for any state to be in. And what happens as a result of that, you see California doing right now, which is an intense negotiation with its insurance providers, with the companies, to try to figure out how to get them to stay in the state. And that's a complex kind of negotiation where you allow them to raise rates and you allow them other, loopholes or ways to escape liability in exchange in certain circumstances or in certain communities in exchange for continuing to offer coverage in other parts of the state. And I think that there's no, that's a dance that's currently underway here. And there's lots of losers and there's good investigative reporting coming out about sort of the shortfalls of that process, but the big picture is to try to strike a balance where using the free market, those companies do choose to stay in a state that faces these climate pressures like California or like Florida.
You write about how, correct me if I'm wrong in this, but I got the sense some of this risk is socialized in the sense that there are people who live in very high risk areas, but there are other people who live in low risk areas. But one way of spreading around the risk is to just make everybody's rates a bit higher. Are people in low risk areas subsidizing people in high risk areas?
Yes, it's always been that way, and that's how insurance works. And that's how your auto insurance has worked as well, right? You pay for living in Boston, your auto insurance that is slightly subsidizing the bad decisions of a teenage driver who lives in Texas, right? So that pooling of risk and that pooling of risk is meant to even out, the sharp, spikes and drops in that cycle. And when you have an environment like climate change presents, where your overall risk is steadily increasing over time, then the cost burden on that pool is also going to steadily increase over time. And there's a lot of data that's starting to show this for property insurance, across the country, not just in those most extreme places that we've been talking about, but almost across the entire country, the cost of insuring your home is dramatically increasing.
I mean, people who remember the Great Recession, a lot of what was at the root of that was mortgage-backed securities, right? It was the housing market that was kind of at the root of the collapse. If the housing market were to collapse in Florida, which is just one state, there's 50 states, do economists worry about a contagion, essentially, that could bring down the economy, that it could really hurt things for people who don't even live in Florida?
Yeah, absolutely. I talk to economists who worry about this, and it can happen in a lot of different ways. The collapse of home values, but also the collapse of the communities where those homes, are located. So this is that city infrastructure, and city revenue mechanism. Do you have a population to support the tax base? Do you have political support for tax rates as the cost equation of owning a home goes up, right? For example, you own your $500,000 home and it costs you 10% of it to insure. If that insurance cost for you becomes 15%, then you're not going to pass that tax measure to fund the schools the next year. And these are the kinds of things that the economists that I talk to do worry about snowballing into, a potential broader, more contagious economic crisis.
Do you assume that in places like New York and Boston, and maybe other places too along the coast, that they are going to pay billions of dollars to construct like seawall? Because it's hard to imagine, like, let's relocate New York City. I mean, it's just hard to imagine that's going to happen. Do you imagine that these places are rich enough that they're going to funnel huge amounts of money? And I think these projects are just incredibly expensive to do something like build a wall to keep the ocean out?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think
Okay.
that is the future for wealthy major metro areas, not just in the United States, but around the world. And you have cities
Okay.
like Shanghai, also
Yeah.
incredibly vulnerable to rising seas. And there is too much economically, as well as, from a national security standpoint, to surrender those places. And so I do think, when the kind of moment of truth comes for policymakers and planners, they will invest whatever is necessary to protect those places. The flip side of that is that some places will not be protectable, right? And so if you don't have the enormous wealth of a Boston or a New York City, if you're a small community or a medium-sized community and you also need a seawall along, say, the coast of Georgia, you're not going to get it. And so over time, those communities that, are experiencing sea level rise in those places will literally be underwater, and over time they will empty out or they will retreat, and people will leave, and so that's kind of the crux of the most difficult part of the climate migration conversation in the United States is that some places will be saved and some places won't be, and we can have all of the good intention and rhetorical conversations about not leaving anybody behind that you want, but economically it will never be affordable to save every place.
We talked a little bit before about the gap between the rich and the poor, but I wonder if you can expand upon that a little bit. And you have a line that I want to throw at you from the book. Climate change is about to make the differences between winners and losers so extreme that they will threaten the underpinnings of the American economy and security. Maybe you can talk about both of those words, economy and security, which when I first read it, I was like, what? Talk about that.
Okay. Take a big step back first to just the inequality, right? So the pressures of climate change exacerbate divisions that we've long had in our society, and a lot of them go back to racial inequality and to redlining of cities across this country, and the patterns created by historical redline have left difference of valuation of properties, a difference of services as basic as water treatment plants, for example. And so disadvantaged communities not only start with a lower, basis of revenue and money in general, but they're less prepared for the onslaught of climatic changes because there's been less investment in their infrastructure over a long period of time.
And they're hotter. I have to say, you have this great example of this part of LA, I think Cypress Park, where it's like 10, 15% tree cover, but Beverly Hills is 50%, 15 versus 50. And in these places, there can be, between the big tree cover places and the non-tree cover places in LA, there can be a 10-degree difference, which, if it's 90 degrees, matters.
It's extraordinary. So, and that difference in heat literally translates to higher rates of mortality in the Black community in Los Angeles than in the white community, higher rates of all sorts of other health effects. And I use Los Angeles as an example because it's a stark example, but it's true in every city across the country that, minority communities in U.S. cities have 20 to 40% less tree cover than wealthy and often Caucasian segments of those same cities. And that tree cover translates to higher temperatures in heat waves, as well as a lot of the other things that we're talking about. So you have a difference in vulnerability in the face of these enormous threats. And so then the question is, what happens next as those threats, the heat waves, the fires, the storms increase, and as government responds to those? And it's a choice between kind of making up for the inequality of the past so that you can create a level playing, not just for social justice reasons, but for basic economic reasons. So you can create, a stable level playing field to go forward into this dangerous future with, or whether you have perpetuate a system that allows that those two types of communities to face climate challenges in unequal ways, which means that they'll move further and further apart. And globally, whether it's in Mexico or in North Africa or in the southern United States, there's more social strife between communities that are sharply divided, and being sharply divided economically is one of those key ways. And so the more that United States communities allow themselves to be increasingly economically divided, the less stability they can expect to experience, and the greater potential there is for conflict, whether that conflict comes in the form of rising crime or greater acute environmental problems like pollution and litter and sewage treatment problems. I mean, there's a real risk of sliding backwards developmentally if you allow impoverished parts of American society to grow in size and become more and more impoverished. Right? So our overall development decreases, and when that happens, there's a greater potential for conflict and instability between the economically privileged and prosperous and those without privilege. And that's going to be a tension for many American communities in the future.
A final question for you, which we haven't touched on at all, but I think people think about. You write about how I think about 1% of the world right now lives in this like barely livable, what we call like a hot zone. But that's going to skyrocket to something like 20% of the world. I assume as all this, turmoil is going on in the U.S. with like insurance policies in Florida and fires in California, there is also, I assume, going to be pressure from the southern border. I wonder if you think this is true in a way we have probably not seen before. And on top of the climate piece of that, I feel like, and you have seen the resistance to that in the last few years, there's a security piece to that too. Like if the walls have to get higher and higher and the crowds outside get bigger and bigger.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is the big picture, the global dynamic of climate-driven migration. What you're referring to is what the researchers who look at this call the human habitat niche. And it finds that for a couple thousand years, people around the world have always lived in an ideal range of temperature and precipitation. And that's where most of the planet's population is and where it has thrived for as long as we have recorded historically. And that's changing. And as you said, the ideal niche for human habitat is shifting really sharply north or towards the poles, but the landmass is north. So it's shifting northward. And as it does, the places in equatorial parts of the world are being left behind. They're kind of sliding outside of that niche, and that's where all the people live. And so, 2 to 3 billion people are estimated to slide outside of that climate niche. And the past patterns suggest that that number of people will make a decision about migrating. And so that is the potential scale that you have of global migration in response to climate change. And absolutely, that's going to mean more pressure on the US border, on Europe, on Russia, on anywhere northward. And we're already seeing that out of South and Central America on the US border now or over the past couple of years. And long term, when you iron out, the ups and downs of, immigration cycles, it's for certain a security challenge for the United States and a border challenge for the United States and for all of the other countries like us.
Abrahm Lustgarten is the author of On the Move. He's also an editor-at-large at ProPublica. Abrahm, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate the conversation.
Please subscribe to It Turns Out on YouTube and like us. You can also write us a review on Apple Podcasts, which helps other people discover us. Thanks to the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation for their generous support. Thanks to producer Matt Purdy. And thanks to you for watching. Talk to you next time.